October 15th, 1888, the people of Fort Smith, Arkansas, gathered for a wedding that would leave a stain on their community for years to come. 45-year-old lumber magnate Nathaniel Decker stood at the altar beside his new bride, 22-year-old Rose Sullivan. Just 3 months earlier, Rose had been engaged to Nathaniel's son William until a so-called hunting accident left the young man dead. What most thought was an act of compassion, a grieving father marrying his son's fiancée to give her security, was in truth the endgame of a dark and calculated affair. Behind the smiles and vows lay a conspiracy that included multiple failed murder attempts, a slow campaign of poisoning, and finally a staged accident that silenced William forever. Hidden records in the Sebastian County Courthouse, buried away for over a century, tell of evidence that officials deliberately ignored and of witnesses who vanished or died whenever they dared to speak. This was more than a tragedy. It was a cover-up that reached into the very foundations of the county's wealth and power. To understand the scandal, you need to know the world in which it unfolded. In 1888, Sebastian County was booming, its prosperity fueled by the timber industry and the steady flow of trade along the Arkansas River. Fort Smith had transformed from a rugged military outpost into a thriving hub where ranchers, merchants, and lumbermen jockeyed for influence in the post-Civil War economy. Nathaniel Decker had arrived in the county 15 years earlier, bringing with him capital from Tennessee and a fierce determination. He purchased a failing sawmill and turned it into the largest lumber operation between Little Rock and the Indian Territory. By 1888, the Decker Lumber Company employed over 200 men and controlled thousands of acres of timberland in the Ozark foothills, its steam-powered saws ringing out daily across the valley. At 45, Nathaniel was a commanding presence, 6 feet tall. Steel-gray hair, sharp blue eyes, and a reputation built on ambition and charm. His wife Margaret had died 3 years earlier of consumption, leaving him with their only son, William. William, at 23, was intelligent and kind-hearted, but lacked his father's ruthless drive. He represented both the best and worst of Nathaniel's legacy, bright yet fragile, thoughtful yet hesitant. Where Nathaniel saw every opportunity as a battlefield to be conquered, William saw responsibility, compromise, and the weight of expectation. It was this clash of character combined with a forbidden romance that set the stage for betrayal, murder, and the most infamous wedding Fort Smith had ever seen. At just 26, William Decker handled the safer side of the lumber business, managing books and customer accounts, while avoiding the grueling labor his father believed forged real men. The lumber camp stretched across the wooded hills east of Fort Smith, tied to the main mill by narrow-gauge rail lines that dragged giant logs down to the Arkansas River. These camps were filled with rough-edged workers, Irish and German immigrants, who had left crowded northern cities in search of steady pay on the frontier. They slept in crude bunkhouses, worked 6 days a week in brutal conditions that claimed lives every season, and blew off steam in the saloons and gambling halls of Fort Smith's notorious riverfront. Into this world of sawdust and sweat came Rose Sullivan on a clear September morning in 1888. She stepped off the paddle steamer Memphis Belle with little more than a worn carpet bag and a letter of introduction from William. Born in County Cork, Ireland, Rose had emigrated to Boston with her family at age 7. Her father, a dock laborer, died of tuberculosis when she was 15, leaving her mother to scrape by with washing and sewing while raising Rose and her 2 younger brothers. Poverty coupled with Boston's deep anti-Irish prejudice shadowed her youth. By 22, Rose had already endured years of low-paying work as a seamstress, shop girl, and tutor, always aware that her intelligence and ambition far outstripped the narrow roles available to women of her background. That summer, when a marriage broker told her widowed mother that a wealthy Arkansas businessman sought a devout Irish bride for his son. The family saw it as providence. William had cast his search through Catholic parish networks, requesting a young woman of good character, strong faith, and practical skills, someone who would make a suitable wife for a lumber heir. Rose fit the bill, but she also brought a restless drive that would soon shift the course of everyone's fate. William sent her money for the journey and filled his letters with promises of comfort and companionship. He wrote about his love for books and poetry, his dreams of expanding the company into furniture manufacturing, and his hopes for a gentle life together. The trip west took 3 weeks by rail and riverboat, and by the time Rose reached Fort Smith, she had built in her mind a picture of her future husband. What she found at the depot was a polite, nervous young man who matched his letters perfectly, kind, thoughtful, and utterly ordinary. As he fussed about the dust on the road and apologized for the sight of sweaty loggers along the way, Rose's heart sank. Their carriage stopped before the Decker Mansion on Garrison Avenue, one of the grandest homes in the city, with its 3 stories, wrap-around porches, manicured gardens, and carved trim that displayed the fortune Timber had bought. Servants carried her bag to the guest quarters, where she would stay until the wedding planned for October 20th. That evening at dinner, she met Nathaniel Decker, and her carefully charted path began to twist. The dining room was the kind of setting meant to impress oil paintings on burgundy walls, crystal chandeliers, and a long mahogany table draped in white linen. Though the table could hold 12, only 3 places were set that night. At 7 sharp, Nathaniel entered tall and broad-shouldered in a black suit tailored to perfection. From the moment his piercing blue eyes met hers, Rose sensed that her destiny in Arkansas would not follow the course anyone had imagined. Rose had been politely humoring William's chatter about his book collection when the dining room shifted. Nathaniel entered with the easy confidence of a man used to deference's stride, measured his presence undeniable. William leapt up jittery as always and said, "Father, may I present Miss Rose Sullivan?" Nathaniel clasped her hand in both of his, lingering just a shade too long, his piercing blue eyes fixed on hers. "Miss Sullivan?" he said, his voice deep and commanding. "William's letters hardly did justice to your beauty. Welcome to our home." The words inappropriate from a father to his son's fiancée unsettled her, and yet Rose felt the heat of recognition. For the first time in her life, a man wasn't looking through her as though she were a servant or a burden. Nathaniel saw her. Throughout dinner, she found her gaze straying toward him, while William earnestly outlined plans for a honeymoon in New Orleans. Nathaniel spoke sparingly, but when he did, his voice dominated the room. He told stories of business ventures and political dealings, of taming wilderness into profit and commanding the loyalty of hundreds of men. Rose heard the cadence of a man who bent the world to his will. Beside him, William wilted. He mumbled half-formed opinions, always pulling back with a nervous, "Of course I could be wrong, or perhaps Father would explain it better." When pressed on production figures, William stumbled, his eyes darting to Nathaniel for approval. His father listened, then smiled in a way that chilled Rose. "You must understand, Miss Sullivan," he said, as dessert arrived. "William has many admirable qualities, but business requires a certain ruthlessness that doesn't come naturally to him. He is too gentle for his own good." It sounded like a compliment, but Rose caught the sharpened edge beneath the words. When William tried to claim her attention after dinner, suggesting they retire to the library to browse his poetry collection, Nathaniel cut in smoothly. "Perhaps Miss Sullivan would prefer to see where our prosperity begins. I'll be riding to Camp 3 tomorrow to inspect our new steam donkey. A woman destined to join this family should know the source of its fortune." William hesitated, clearly wounded, but his protest crumbled under his father's tone. "Of course, if Rose would find it interesting, he muttered. She agreed at once, though her reasons were murky, even to herself. Something in Nathaniel's invitation carried the charge of danger, and danger was a sensation she had never tasted, but suddenly craved. The next morning broke cool and bright autumn, beginning to paint the hills east of Fort Smith in amber and rust. Rose dressed for practicality, choosing a dark blue wool gown with little bustle suitable for riding side saddle. At the stables, Nathaniel was already waiting, reins in hand. He had chosen a steady mare for her and a massive black stallion for himself. William was nowhere in sight. "My son sends his regrets," Nathaniel said as he offered her a hand into the saddle. An urgent matter called him to Van Buren. Business waits for no one. The smile he gave her was knowing deliberate. Rose's pulse quickened. She was alone with Nathaniel, and for the first time in her life, she felt as though the careful borders of her world had been torn wide open. Rose let Nathaniel's explanation pass, though a subtle edge in his tone left her wondering if William's sudden absence was less accident than design. As they rode through the misty morning woods, she studied him from the corner of her eye, the strong cut of his jaw, the streaks of silver in his dark hair, catching the light the way he seemed utterly at ease in the saddle. Their journey to Camp 3 took nearly 2 hours, the narrow roads twisting through dense forest. Nathaniel filled the time with stories of his early years in Sebastian County, pointing out ridges, creeks, and clearings that marked the growth of his lumber empire. His voice carried a pride that was almost contagious as he spoke of ancient oaks, brought down by his men, of the brutal challenge of dragging timber down mountain slopes, and of the satisfaction in seeing rough logs transformed into lumber that would raise cities and fortunes along the frontier. The camp itself spread across a hillside, clearing its rough-hewn buildings dwarfed by stacks of freshly cut logs. At the center loomed the new steam donkey, a powerful winch that belched smoke into the crisp air. Rose expected to remain an observer while Nathaniel oversaw his business, but he insisted she learn. He guided her step by step, showing how the cables hauled logs, weighing tons up slopes where horses would fail, how the lines were secured to keep workers safe from crushing accidents, how the fire and steam powered the whole brutal machine. Then he placed his hands over hers, on the controls, letting her throttle and release the line, until the massive log slid neatly into position. "You have good instincts," he said, with a glint in his eye. "Most women would never dare." Rose's reply slipped out before she could stop herself. "I'm not most women." Heat rushed to her face at her own boldness, but Nathaniel only smiled. "No," he said softly, "you certainly are not." They ate a simple lunch at a wooden table near the foreman's office, sandwiches and bitter coffee taken, while Nathaniel reviewed figures and gave orders to his crew leaders. Rose watched the way the men interacted with him, respectful, yes, but wary, careful not to test the limits of his patience. Nathaniel's authority was absolute, the kind that commanded both loyalty and fear. On the ride back toward Fort Smith, as the sun dipped and shadows stretched long through the trees, Nathaniel steered the conversation into unfamiliar territory. They paused at a creek, the water skipping over stones, and he asked, "Tell me, Miss Sullivan, what are your expectations for marriage?" Rose, careful in her words, answered, as she had been raised to. She would be a good wife, support her husband, raise children who carried on the family name. Nathaniel listened, then shook his head slightly. "Those are admirable, but they don't tell me what you hope to gain for yourself beyond security and respectability." No one in Boston had ever asked her that. For most of her life, survival had been enough. After a long silence, she admitted, "I suppose I hope to matter. To be part of something important, something that changes the world." Nathaniel stepped down from his horse. picked up a smooth stone and sent it skimming across the creek. Then he turned his eyes fixed on her. "And do you believe marriage to William will give you that chance?" The question burned in her chest, scandalous, dangerous, and yet impossible to ignore. Her cheeks flushed. "William is a good man," she said quietly. Nathaniel's smile was faint, knowing. That he replied was not what I asked. Rose slid from her saddle, her pulse quickening with the need to move, to think, to make sense of why every word with Nathaniel felt like trespassing into dangerous but irresistible territory. "William is gentle," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "He is kind, well-educated, and will provide for his family with respect." Nathaniel's gaze cut through her practiced diplomacy. "Not what I asked," he reminded her. She turned to face him, fully caught in the weight of those blue eyes. The truth spilled out before she could stop it. "No," she admitted quietly. "I don't believe marriage to William will give me that chance. He follows where others lead. He'll never build anything of his own." Nathaniel stepped closer, the scent of pine and smoke clinging to him like a second skin. "And building something matters to you?" "Yes," Rose whispered. His answer came with the gravity of confession. "Then you understand my dilemma. I've built an empire over 25 years, and it will die with me because my son hasn't the will to carry it forward." Rose knew the proper thing would be to retreat, to climb back on her horse and insist they return at once. Instead, she asked the question that changed everything. "What do you intend to do about that?" Nathaniel didn't answer with words. As he helped her mount, his fingers brushed hers, a fleeting contact, heavy with promise. The ride back to Fort Smith was cloaked in silence, but the air between them was alive with tension. When they reached the mansion, William was already waiting, anxious, relieved. "How was your ride?" he asked, searching their faces. "Educational," Rose said, catching the subtle curve of Nathaniel's mouth at her choice of word. That night, lying awake in her guest room, Rose knew she stood at a crossroads. To marry William meant security, comfort, and a life of quiet resignation. To follow the path that had opened before her, the pull toward Nathaniel was to embrace a dangerous desire that demanded she shed the woman she had been. Sleep finally overtook her, and in her dreams she felt again the raw power of machinery, the weight of logs sliding into place, and Nathaniel's steady hands guiding her own. In the weeks that followed, a pattern emerged, outwardly harmless, but in truth a slow tightening of the net that bound her to Nathaniel. William, pleased by what he assumed was his fiancée's practical curiosity, encouraged her interest in the lumber business. He never imagined those educational outings were more than lessons in timber and profit. Nathaniel made certain of it. He appeared at the mansion with urgent papers, blueprints, and messages that required Rose's input, or rather her presence. Each errand became an excuse: tours of potential mill sites, inspections at the riverside lumber yards, meetings with machinery salesmen from Chicago. Rose accepted every invitation. She asked sharp questions, absorbed every detail, and surprised even Nathaniel with her quick grasp of technical and strategic matters. But beneath the surface, these lessons became something more. Nathaniel was not only teaching her business, he was reshaping how she viewed the world. He spoke of power as something seized, not bestowed. He revealed weakness as a flaw that the successful could never afford. He praised the satisfaction of bending the world to one's will. "William has never understood this," Nathaniel told her one crisp October morning as they rode the timberlands. "He believes fairness will bring success. But fairness is a luxury reserved for those who have already won." Rose found herself nodding at truths that would once have scandalized her, realizing with each passing day that she was no longer the same woman who had stepped off the Memphis Belle just weeks earlier. Rose had remarked that William seemed to expect others to act honorably, simply because he did, and Nathaniel's sharp reply, "Exactly, and that assumption will destroy everything I've built, unless someone with clearer vision takes control," settled over her like a dare. His words were not idle philosophy. They were a challenge, an invitation to step into his world, where power mattered more than kindness, where ambition outranked morality. Rose began to see that every conversation was a test, that Nathaniel was shaping her into a partner who could think and act as ruthlessly as he did. Meanwhile, William's behavior shifted in ways that only underscored the gulf between him and his father. Perhaps he sensed the unspoken tension, or perhaps his nature simply bent further under the weight of his father's dominance. But his attentiveness to Rose took on a nervous edge. He deferred to Nathaniel constantly, asking permission to take Rose on walks, consulting his father on wedding arrangements, and hedging every opinion with lines like, "Of course, father may think differently." What might once have seemed respectful now came across as weakness. Where Nathaniel commanded, William asked. Where Nathaniel acted, William stalled. Rose, who had once admired William's gentleness in his letters, now felt it as a flaw, a hollowness at the center of the man she was meant to marry. The breaking point came on October 8th. Less than 2 weeks before the wedding, William had arranged a private picnic at Ozark Landing, complete with the prepared meal flowers gathered by the groundskeeper, and even a poem he had written to read as the sun sank over the Arkansas River. It was the kind of romantic gesture Rose might have once treasured. But just as the hour arrived, Nathaniel declared that William was urgently needed at the sawmill. A critical machinery breakdown threatened to halt production, and without immediate repairs and a parts deal with a Chicago supplier who was leaving the next day, the mill would lose a week of output. William faltered, stricken by the conflict. "Couldn't the repairs wait until morning?" he asked weakly. Nathaniel's reply was final, practical, unyielding. "The supervisor is bedridden with fever, and the dealer leaves tomorrow. If the work isn't done tonight, we lose everything." The trap was perfectly set. William could either go through with his carefully planned romantic evening, or prove his maturity by putting duty above desire. There was, of course, only one answer Nathaniel would accept. After a pained pause, William surrendered. "Of course. Business must come first. Rose will understand." He turned to her, guilt etched in his face. "I'm terribly sorry, Rose. We'll have our picnic tomorrow. The sunset will be just as beautiful." His sincerity only deepened her disappointment. She saw with sudden clarity that William would always choose the path of least resistance, even if it meant betraying himself and her. Nathaniel, ever the strategist, offered a convenient alternative. "Perhaps Rose would like to see the mill while you're making the repairs. She has such an interest in our operations, and this would be an excellent opportunity to watch the men at work." William's face brightened, relieved by his father's suggestion. Rose, however, recognized it for what it was, not a simple invitation, but another carefully laid step in a plan that was slowly, inexorably binding her to Nathaniel's world. William saw his father's offer as the perfect solution, a thoughtful way to keep Rose entertained while he handled the emergency at the mill. "Would you mind terribly, Rose?" he asked, his face eager and hopeful. "Father knows the operations better than anyone, and you did say you wanted to understand every part of the business." Rose smiled and agreed, her voice light with enthusiasm, though her true excitement had little to do with lumber or machinery. She was beginning to see Nathaniel's hand behind every circumstance. What once seemed like chance now revealed itself as carefully placed pieces on a board only he controlled. The breakdown at the mill may have been real, but Nathaniel's invitation was anything but spontaneous. When William departed with his tools and repair notes, the mansion seemed to expand around Rose and Nathaniel. Without William's nervous energy, the air between them was heavier, charged with the weight of choices they had not yet spoken aloud. "Shall we go to the mill?" Nathaniel asked as they stood in the hall. Rose met his gaze unflinching. "I'd rather not," she said softly. His answering smile told her everything. Acknowledgement, triumph, warning. A line had been crossed, and there would be no turning back. That night, instead of walking through sawdust and steam, they wandered the moonlit gardens behind the mansion. The scent of late roses clung to the air. The fountain whispered in the dark, and their words flowed with the intensity of a confession long deferred. "I've been married," Nathaniel said at last, his voice low. "I know the difference between affection and passion. William offers you one. I could offer you the other." Rose's heart pounded at his boldness. "He is your son," she whispered. "Yes," Nathaniel answered without hesitation. "And that makes this both impossible and inevitable." In the silver light, she saw the struggle in his face, the tightening of his jaw, the flicker of desire breaking through a lifetime of discipline. Here was a man who had built an empire with precision and strategy, admitting that some forces could not be managed. "What are you suggesting?" Rose asked, though the answer already trembled in her chest. "That some hungers are too powerful to ignore?" Nathaniel said. Rose turned away, fighting the clarity she had sought since arriving in Arkansas. "And William?" she asked. Nathaniel's reply was cold, merciless. "William will survive disappointment. He has before." The callousness of the words should have chilled her, but instead they stirred something darker, an awareness that in Boston she would have been nobody living and dying in obscurity. William offered escape. Nathaniel offered power. "I need time," she said finally, her voice unsteady but firm. Nathaniel inclined his head every inch the strategist, who knew he had already won. "Of course, but don't wait too long. Opportunities don't wait twice." The next morning, William reappeared pale from exhaustion, but overflowing with apologies. He had worked through the night to repair the machinery, and in his weariness, his gentleness only deepened. He promised Rose that business would never again rob them of their personal time. He spoke with sincerity, with love. Yet to Rose his promises felt like the echo of a weaker man's hope, already overshadowed by the fire Nathaniel had kindled the night before. At breakfast the next morning, William tried to smooth over his absence with hopeful curiosity. "Did Father give you an interesting tour of the mill?" he asked, eager to believe Nathaniel's company had made up for the evening she had lost. Rose answered carefully. "We didn't actually visit the mill. Your father thought it would be inappropriate for a lady to observe industrial work after dark." William's shoulders eased with relief, grateful to think she had been properly chaperoned. What he failed to notice was the fleeting glance exchanged between Rose and Nathaniel, a silent acknowledgement of the truth they had chosen not to tell. That look marked the first of many small lies, the opening thread of a conspiracy that would grow until it wove a noose around William's future. In the days that followed, Nathaniel found increasingly inventive reasons to claim Rose's time. A property purchase required a woman's perspective on the condition of the home. A dinner with New Orleans lumber buyers would benefit from the refinement of a cultured female guest. Machinery suppliers from Chicago expected not just contracts, but polished conversation in private dining rooms. Each request sounded practical, respectable, and William encouraged them with enthusiasm. To him, Nathaniel's willingness to involve Rose was a gesture of acceptance, a sign that his fiancée was being welcomed fully into the family. He saw her eagerness as proof of her devotion to their shared future. But others in Fort Smith noticed details William never thought to question. From her vantage point across Garrison Avenue, Mrs. Adelaide Forrester saw Nathaniel's carriage arriving at his own home with unusual frequency during the day, lingering for hours at a time, when William was occupied at the sawmill. In the River District, hotelier Thomas Brennan found himself arranging private rooms for Nathaniel's supposed business associates, women whose resemblance to Rose was too close to be coincidence. His wife, skeptical, pointed out that respectable businessmen usually signed contracts in their offices, not behind closed doors at hotels. Most troubling of all was Father Michael O'Brien, the Irish Catholic priest preparing to officiate the wedding. In his meetings with Rose, he heard little of love or devotion for her intended husband. Instead, she spoke with fiery passion about building something lasting, about finding a purpose greater than survival, about the thrill of wielding real influence. It was the language of ambition, not affection. Marriage is a sacrament, Father O'Brien reminded her gently, not a business partnership. Rose nodded, murmuring assent, but her words rang hollow as if spoken from duty rather than conviction. These fragments, an observant neighbor, a cautious innkeeper, a worried priest, might have remained only whispers in drawing rooms and pews. But the pieces began to fit together. When Margaret Henley, the sharp-tongued wife of Fort Smith's second-largest lumber dealer, took an interest. Known for her talent at prying secrets into the open, Margaret had both the motive and the influence to turn gossip into scandal. And in the weeks before the wedding, she began to do exactly that. Margaret Henley had spent years perfecting her role as Fort Smith's unofficial watchdog, a woman whose power rested not on wealth alone, but on her unrivaled command of gossip and scandal. She had exposed adulteries, ruined reputations, and even toppled a bank clerk who thought he could siphon funds unnoticed. So when she spotted Nathaniel Decker escorting Rose Sullivan into Murphy's Tavern on a Tuesday afternoon, a place where loggers, rivermen, and cattle drivers downed whiskey by the gallon, her instincts sharpened. No respectable man would take his son's fiancée there, not unless he was trying to avoid being seen elsewhere. From that moment, Margaret began weaving a net around the Decker household. She dispatched her Irish maid Colleen to chat up Rose about wedding details, hoping to catch slips of truth between talk of lace and bouquets. She pressed her husband Harold to bring Nathaniel into their weekly poker games, where bourbon might loosen lips more effectively than interrogation. And she adjusted her afternoon walks so that she passed the Decker mansion at strategic hours, noting carriages that lingered too long, doors that closed too quickly. Her observations confirmed her darkest suspicions. Nathaniel and Rose were meeting in secret, often under flimsy pretexts of business. Their conversations, by all accounts, carried a charge that had nothing to do with timber contracts. Margaret's inquiries also uncovered troubling signs in William. Once a steady, if unremarkable young man, he now stumbled through social gatherings, pale and exhausted, his humor dampened by headaches and stomach pains. At work, too, he faltered. Harold returned from poker one night with a tidbit Nathaniel had offered William was simply overworked, needing rest before the wedding. But the mill supervisors whispered a different story. William could scarcely make it through the day without collapsing. Margaret's instinct told her that the pieces fit together. William's unexplained illness, Nathaniel's secretive companionship with Rose, the sudden intimacy between father and future daughter-in-law. It was all connected. She couldn't yet prove it, but she sensed rot beneath the surface of the Decker empire. Her chance came on October 17th, just 3 days before the wedding. The day dawned gray and wet, the kind of dreary drizzle that blurred windows and kept carriages mired in mud. It was weather that concealed more than it revealed, perfect for secrets and confidences. William was meant to travel to Little Rock to finalize a timber contract, but instead, he was doubled over in agony, unable to stand upright from the cramping in his gut. Dr. Samuel Hayes, summoned to the mansion, diagnosed stress and prescribed bland meals and bed rest. But Margaret, ever the predator, circling the scent of weakness, suspected something far more sinister was at work inside the Decker household. And she knew the storm breaking over Fort Smith was only just beginning. Dr. Hayes assured Nathaniel that William's decline was nothing unusual, just the kind of nervous collapse young men often suffered before a wedding. A few days of rest, he said, would set things right. Nathaniel nodded, his expression the picture of paternal concern. But Rose, watching closely, caught a fleeting look that told another story, not worry, but satisfaction, as if William's illness had come as a welcome convenience. With William bedridden and unable to travel, Nathaniel quickly announced that he would handle the Little Rock negotiations himself. The trip would take 2 days, perhaps 3, if talks dragged on. Then, with the practiced ease of a man who always dressed ambition in the language of practicality, he suggested Rose accompany him. "She's shown such interest in our operations," he said smoothly. "It would be valuable for her to learn contract terms and pricing strategies." The doctor agreed readily, praising the idea of a refined lady lending civility to rough business dealings. Rose accepted with an eagerness that should have raised eyebrows, but those around her chose to see only devotion to the family's prosperity. In truth, she knew exactly what this trip promised: time with Nathaniel away from the eyes of Fort Smith. From her window across Garrison Avenue, Margaret Henley watched the Decker carriage roll toward the station. She needed no explanation. To her, the sight of Nathaniel traveling with his son's fiancée days before the wedding was confirmation of everything she had suspected. Margaret wasted no time. She dispatched her most trusted servant to the telegraph office, sending urgent messages to her circle of informants in Little Rock society, women whose gossip networks were as sharp as her own. They would watch Nathaniel and Rose like hawks, then, basket of herbs in hand and an expression of maternal concern carefully arranged on her face, Margaret paid a visit to the Decker mansion. She found William propped weakly in bed, grateful for company. His pallor was startling, his frame thinner than it had been weeks before, his hands trembling beneath the blankets. His eyes, once gentle and intelligent, now seemed clouded and slow. Margaret clucked sympathetically, stroking his arm as though he were her own child. "Dr. Hayes says it's just nerves, but you look terribly ill," she murmured. "Tell me, have you been eating properly?" William admitted that food had lost its appeal, that flavors seemed strange, that even his favorites left him queasy. He spoke of headaches, stomach cramps, and exhaustion, all of which he attributed to nerves and business strain. But Margaret recognized the signs immediately. She had seen them 3 years earlier when Samuel Reeves wasted away under the careful hand of a wife who had been slipping arsenic into his meals. The slow decline, the stomach troubles, the trembling hands. It was all too familiar. Her voice remained gentle as she asked, "And do you eat the same foods as your father and Miss Sullivan?" William frowned, thinking carefully, his mind sluggish. "Father often dines at the hotel for business. Rose, she's been joining clients quite often, learning about the trade." You understand. Margaret did, perfectly. If her instincts were right, Nathaniel and Rose were ensuring that William alone consumed the poison while they remained untouched. "Who prepares your food, dear?" she pressed. "Mrs. Patterson, our cook," William replied slowly. "Though sometimes Father brings tonics from Dr. Hayes to help my stomach. And Rose, she's been so kind. She often brings me tea or broth when I can't manage dinner." His words confirmed Margaret's darkest suspicions. What William saw as care and devotion, Margaret recognized as the precise and deliberate delivery of poison. And with the wedding just days away, she understood how little time remained before William Decker's fate was sealed. Margaret Henley left the Decker mansion chilled to her core, carrying with her the unmistakable conviction that William's decline was no accident. The timing of his illness, the way it worsened when Nathaniel was at home, and eased when he traveled the innocent details William shared about food and tonics prepared specially for him, all of it pointed to deliberate poisoning. Yet Margaret knew too well that whispers and suspicion were not enough to topple a man as powerful as Nathaniel Decker. If she moved too soon, she risked not only her own credibility, but her standing in Fort Smith society. For now, she would bide her time gathering the threads until she could weave them into a noose. Meanwhile, in Little Rock, Nathaniel and Rose found that distance from William only intensified their bond. Long train rides gave them hours of uninterrupted conversation. Hotel suites freed them from the pretenses demanded in Fort Smith. Business meetings showcased Rose's intelligence in ways no parlor small talk ever could. "We work well together," Nathaniel said one evening as they reviewed contracts. "You see these negotiations more clearly than William ever has." Wine loosened Rose's reserve, and she answered honestly, "William doesn't want to understand. He does his duties, but he has no passion for the work. He'd rather write poetry than build an empire." Nathaniel's eyes locked on hers. "And you, what would you rather do?" Rose knew the answer carried consequences she could never undo. "I'd rather build an empire." The kiss that followed shattered every barrier of propriety. By dawn, they had not only crossed into physical intimacy, but also into a darker realm of shared ambition. In whispers, they spoke of William's illness and of how fate sometimes carried away the weak. They never said murder aloud, but both understood what was being planned. William's death would free Rose from a marriage she no longer wanted and give Nathaniel both the woman he desired and a story the town would accept, a grieving father consoling a bereaved bride. Yet when they returned to Fort Smith the following evening, they found Margaret Henley waiting at the station. "Mr. Decker," she called sweetly, "I trust your business went well. Poor William has been quite worried." Her tone was polite, but her eyes carried a warning sharp enough to pierce both Nathaniel and Rose. Then came the dagger, delivered with a smile. William seemed much improved this afternoon, almost as if the change in his routine had been beneficial. The implication was unmistakable. Margaret had noticed the link between William's health and Nathaniel's presence. She was letting them know she was watching. As the carriage rattled back to the mansion, Nathaniel and Rose sat in silence, both realizing that their carefully measured plan was running out of time. Margaret's suspicion meant that William's slow decline could no longer be allowed to continue. They needed an ending swift, decisive, and unquestionable. The solution came in the form of a tradition as old as the frontier itself, a hunting trip. On the morning of October 19th, 1888, Nathaniel announced a farewell hunt for William and a select group of friends, a bachelor's outing before the wedding. William, who had perked up slightly since Nathaniel's return, accepted eagerly. Hunting was one of the few pursuits where he could forget his weakness, and the promise of fresh air and camaraderie appealed far more than any dinner party. The guest list was deliberate. Harold Henley, Margaret's husband, Thomas Brennan, the hotelier, Dr. Samuel Hayes, and James Crawford, the mill's chief supervisor. All respectable men, all trusted voices, whose testimony would shield Nathaniel from suspicion should tragedy strike. Nathaniel personally chose the location, a remote stretch of timberland, where thickets and fallen logs would create blind spots and confusion. He specified which rifles to bring, insisting on certain weapons better suited for deer in heavy cover. He even outlined the formation, ensuring that he and William would be placed in positions where a so-called hunting mishap could occur naturally. Before departing, William paused to reassure Rose. "I know it's not ideal leaving you the day before our wedding," he said earnestly, "but it will be good to have one last outing with my friends." Rose smiled and encouraged him, hiding the knowledge that her own role was already set. She had arranged to spend the afternoon with Margaret Henley, an alibi designed to shield her from suspicion. While the men ventured into the forest, Rose would sit with the very woman most determined to expose her, knowing that in the hours ahead, William Decker's fate would finally be sealed. The hunting party set out at first light, their rifles loaded into the wagon beside ammunition provisions and the small luxuries that made such outings as much about fellowship as sport. William was teased good-naturedly about his jitters, the men joking that a wedding was scarier than a wild buck. Dr. Hayes had brought a flask of whiskey to toast any successful kill, while Harold Henley produced Cuban cigars, promising a celebratory smoke if the day proved fruitful. Only Nathaniel remained silent, his eyes on the terrain, his mind turning over lines of sight slopes and cover, as if the woods themselves were pieces on a chessboard. The timber tract was vast. Hundreds of acres of oak and pine, riddled with underbrush and fallen logs. Nathaniel suggested a loose line formation, spreading out just far enough to cover ground, while keeping each man in visual contact. The others praised his caution as thoughtful leadership, never realizing it was calculated to isolate William. In such terrain, a misplaced shot could easily be mistaken for a tragic accident. The morning passed with distant gunfire echoing through the hills, but no clean kills. By midday, the hunters gathered at a creek, sharing sandwiches, coffee, and laughter. William seemed almost reborn, his color high, his mood light. He spoke easily of the wedding, accepted the men's teasing, and looked healthier than he had in weeks. "You look like a new man," Dr. Hayes said approvingly. "Fresh air works wonders." Nathaniel agreed, though only Rose would have recognized the irony in his tone. After lunch, the group split again, this time into rougher terrain. Slopes, thickets, and shifting light made the ground treacherous. Nathaniel maneuvered himself about 50 yards behind William, the perfect distance to explain a fatal error. Around 2:30, a single rifle crack tore through the stillness. The men rushed toward the sound, finding Nathaniel on his knees, his hands slick with blood hovering over William's body. The young man's chest bore a devastating wound. "I thought I saw a deer," Nathaniel gasped, his face contorted in anguish. "I fired before I realized, before I saw that William was in the line of fire. Oh God, what have I done?" His distress was convincing, his account plausible. William had been moving through thick brush, his back turned, and the wound was consistent with the kind of accident hunters whispered about around campfires. Dr. Hayes pronounced death instantaneous beyond any chance of saving. The other men, shaken, but not incredulous, accepted the explanation. Hunting was dangerous, and mistakes could be fatal. James Crawford, the most experienced of them all, studied the scene and declared it a textbook accident, tragic, but no one's fault. Yet Harold Henley noticed details that gnawed at him: the angle of the wound, the blackened marks of powder burns. A shot fired from 50 yards would not leave burns like that. He said nothing, unwilling to heap further misery on a grieving father. But the thought lodged in his mind and refused to leave. Back in Fort Smith, Ross was executing her alibi to perfection, seated in Margaret Henley's parlor, with flowers and menus spread before her. When the news arrived breathlessly from a messenger, she reacted as expected. Gasps, tears, the trembling voice of a fiancé in shock. "Oh, the poor man," she sobbed, speaking of Nathaniel rather than William. To lose his son in such a way, how will he ever forgive himself? To the casual observer, her grief would have seemed genuine. But Margaret, practiced in reading people, saw something else flicker behind the veil of tears, a glimmer of satisfaction, too quick to hide. By dusk, when the hunting party returned with William's body, Margaret understood that she had witnessed the conclusion of a plot as ruthless as it was meticulous. And yet she also knew that in Fort Smith, people preferred the comfort of tragic accidents to the ugliness of deliberate murder. On October 21st, 1888, William Decker's funeral drew the largest crowd the town had ever seen. Neighbors, merchants, and workers filled the streets mourning the loss of the young man who had represented the gentler side of the Decker family legacy. But beneath the solemn prayers and bowed heads, a darker truth remained buried, hidden by silent circumstance and the power of a man who had mastered the art of shaping his world, even at the cost of his own son's life. The funeral of William Decker on October 21st, 1888, became one of the largest public gatherings Fort Smith had ever seen. Hundreds filled the Methodist church with mourners spilling into the streets, united in sorrow for a young man whose life had ended too soon. Nathaniel Decker, outwardly crushed by guilt and grief, played his part to perfection. His broken voice during the service and his dramatic collapse at the graveside convinced nearly everyone that his anguish was genuine. Whatever private suspicions lingered among the sharp-eyed, they were washed away by the image of a devastated father mourning his only son. Rose, draped in black, carried herself with solemn dignity. She accepted condolences with quiet composure, her role straddling two worlds, the grieving fiancé and the dutiful woman standing beside a shattered father. When some well-meaning ladies suggested she return to Boston, Rose refused. William would have wanted me to care for his father, she told Father O'Brien, who felt uneasy but lacked the words to express why. Margaret Henley, however, saw the situation clearly. Rose wasn't staying out of obligation. She was staying because Fort Smith offered everything she had ever wanted: wealth, status, and the arm of a man powerful enough to bend fate. Margaret knew she couldn't risk a direct accusation. Nathaniel's reputation was ironclad, his influence too deeply entrenched. Without hard proof, confronting him would mean social ruin for her, not him. Instead, she chose patience. She began carefully observing, documenting, and quietly collecting testimony. Servants' gossip, business records, social appearances all became threads in a tapestry she was determined to complete. Her patience paid off. By Christmas of 1888, Nathaniel and Rose were seen together often, their shared grief portrayed as natural closeness. By Easter of 1889, whispers of an engagement filled parlors and drawing rooms. And in June of that year, just 8 months after William's death, Nathaniel married Rose in a subdued ceremony that framed their union as a triumph of hope over tragedy. To the public, it seemed noble. To Margaret, it reeked of calculation. The couple wasted no time consolidating power. Nathaniel appeared revitalized, and Rose took to her new role with startling confidence. She attended negotiations, spoke with clarity on market strategies, and managed financial details with a precision that astounded seasoned businessmen. Harold Henley, Margaret's husband, confessed privately that Rose's knowledge was too advanced to have been acquired in the few months since William's passing. "It's as if she had been studying the business for months before William died," he said uneasily. Margaret's grim nod confirmed what she had suspected all along. William's death was not an accident born of chance, but a carefully staged elimination designed to clear the path for Nathaniel and Rose's partnership. Yet suspicion was not proof. The conspiracy was airtight. Its only weakness, the people who had been close enough to notice details that didn't fit. That weakness began to crack in 1891. James Crawford, the mill supervisor whose expertise had given Nathaniel's story credibility, died suddenly in his home. Dr. Hayes declared heart failure, noting Crawford's recent chest pains. But Ellen Crawford, confiding in Margaret, revealed her husband's turmoil in the weeks before his death. He had been shaken by repeated visits from Nathaniel, unsettled by things that didn't add up about William's supposed accident, and had even suggested they might need to leave Fort Smith if the truth ever came to light. For Margaret, this revelation was confirmation. Someone who had vouched for Nathaniel's innocence was dead, and not of coincidence. The conspiracy had claimed its first collateral victim, and the circle of silence around William Decker's death was closing tighter. He was frightened, Ellen Crawford admitted to Margaret, not of violence itself, but of something that could ruin their family's name. Margaret needed no further explanation. James Crawford had been the most seasoned hunter in the fatal party, and if anyone could detect the inconsistencies in William's so-called accident, it was him. His sudden death, labeled heart failure, was not coincidence, it was necessity. 6 months later, when Dr. Samuel Hayes, the very physician who had declared William's death accidental, was found broken against a tree in what was ruled a riding mishap, Margaret saw the pattern crystallize. Witnesses weren't simply dying, they were being erased. Her fears sharpened when her own husband began voicing doubts. Harold noticed the trail of bodies, the unsettling timing, the shadows of something more than chance. Margaret knew then that he would be next. In March of 1892, her nightmare came true. After dining at a gathering hosted by Nathaniel and Rose, Harold fell ill. At first it seemed like food poisoning, spoiled oysters, the doctor suggested, but Margaret recognized the signs immediately. The slow weakening, the stomach pains, the trembling hands. She had seen it in William. She watched helplessly as Harold slipped away, another victim of careful, measured poison. This time, though, she was prepared. For 4 years, Margaret had documented everything, the suspicious deaths, the timing of Nathaniel's trips, Rose's increasing authority in the lumber business, the whispered comments of servants and associates. She had even built quiet connections to federal authorities outside Sebastian County, knowing the local law would never act against its most powerful man. When Harold died on March 15, 1892, she tried to act, sending urgent telegrams and begging for intervention. But her pleas went unanswered. The Marshals had other priorities. Fort Smith had its preferred story that Nathaniel and Rose were tragic figures who had turned grief into a new beginning, and no one wanted to replace it with a tale of betrayal and blood. Nathaniel and Rose prospered. They built a mansion that dominated the skyline, had 3 children, and expanded their lumber empire across Arkansas and beyond. Time smoothed away the whispers, leaving behind only admiration for pioneers who had supposedly endured tragedy with dignity. Margaret died in 1894, buried just yards from William. Her suspicions sealed away in private journals. For nearly a century, those journals lay hidden until 1987, when courthouse renovations unearthed them, along with letters between Nathaniel and Rose. Together, the documents revealed not just one murder, but a systematic campaign to eliminate anyone who threatened their secret. What those papers showed was chilling, a pair of conspirators who had remade an entire community's memory, turning themselves from predators into romantic legends. Fort Smith remembered them not as killers, but as lovers who rose from loss. And perhaps that's the most unsettling truth of all. Not just that they murdered and escaped justice, but that they rewrote history itself, binding love and murder so tightly that people chose to believe the lie. So what do you think? Was everything truly uncovered, or might even darker secrets still lie buried in the Arkansas hills? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoy exploring stories like this where history and horror intertwine, be sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this tale with anyone who loves the forgotten crimes of America's past. In our next video, we'll open another door to a mystery time tried to bury.